75 years ago, as war raged in Europe and Japan, delegates from all over the world gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to build a new global financial system. Through their creativity and collaboration, billions were lifted out of poverty all over the world, and the American middle class was created. But nearly a century later, it's time to recognize that the global economy has changed. We need a new system, one that builds on what worked, free markets and free people, and changes what doesn't. We need a new path for the future of capitalism, so countries can heal fractures within their own economies. From excessive inequality to job loss from technology, we need to win the race for the future of money. The rise of digital currencies, the long-term health of the euro and the dollar. We need to harness all the tools of economic statecraft, from using sanctions and trade policy wisely to reining in financial crime. Most of all, we need to remember what they knew in 1945. Economics, finance, and foreign policy are all part of the same story. This is a time to restore and rebuild America's collaborative economic leadership. This is a time for geoeconomics.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Josh Lipsky, the director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center, and thank you all for being with us today. And I want to thank the International Monetary Fund for co-hosting this event. And we're launching a new issue brief, and we'll share it with you in the chat now by Martin Mühleisen, Special Advisor to the Managing Director on urban-rural divide and inequality. Now, we think a lot and talk a lot about inequality here at the Atlantic Council. It's part of our Inclusive Growth Project. And of course, the IMF has made tackling inequality a core part of their work and their mission. But when we think and talk and act on inequality, we often think about it along the dimensions of men and women. We think about it dimensions of old and young. We think about it along racial lines. And one of the issues that is overlooked and misunderstood is what we're going to talk about today: geographic inequality, spatial inequality, the urban-rural divides. And it's so important. It's not just an American issue. It's not just a European issue. It's not just an advanced economy issue. We see it in China. We see it all over the world. And so if we can talk about it, elevate it, understand it better, economists, think tanks, policymakers, it can be the key, as Martin has said in his issue brief, to unlocking a more sustainable post-pandemic recovery. So we're very excited to have this event today. We want everyone to join the conversation. Please submit your questions in the Q&A function. We have a fantastic panel to help dissect and add to the paper and question Martin and answer your questions. And to lead us through the conversation today, I'm very pleased to hand it over to Dr. Nicole Golden, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and a leading thinker and writer on these issues. Nicole, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. It's really a pleasure to be with everyone today. And thanks to everyone who is tuning in far and wide on this July morning. Again, this is a very timely conversation, as Josh has noted, on geographic inequality and rural-urban divides. When we look at geographic or spatial disparities, we observe and experience them, I think, in many different ways, all of which really do have an impact on economic opportunity and inclusive growth, whether it's health disparity, education quality, infrastructure, surely, wages and employment opportunities, the prices of goods and services, and even government service and delivery or participation. And COVID-19, as Josh has said, has really exposed and worsened the situation, particularly within countries. In studies of past pandemics, Gini coefficient measures of inequality have really increased, and models, initial models of the impact of COVID-19 show that same upward trajectory in terms of inequality. And so while the growing rift between rich and poor countries has been more atop recent economic discourse, as Josh said, addressing these challenges, and as Martin alluded to in his paper, within regions and subnationally, has really not been met with the urgency that's required, and even more so now, which is why I'm very eager for this discussion, starting first by talking with Martin Mühleisen, Special Advisor and Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund, about his policy note published today by the Atlantic Council, and then followed by a response conversation with three other fantastic experts before taking your questions. We'll be joined by Tim Bartik, Senior Economist at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, Era Dabla-Norris, Martin's colleague at the International Monetary Fund, the division chief for the Asia and Pacific Department, and Andrés Rodriguez-Pose, who's the Princesa de Asturias Chair and Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics. So without further ado, let's get to it, Martin. Let's briefly talk through your notes, which I really encourage everyone to read. I want to start by asking, the paper really does a nice job of showing why, from a political economy and other perspectives, spatial or geographic inequality has not been as prominent as it should be in the economic recovery or even broader policy debate. Can you tell us why?
Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you to the Atlantic Council and to the IMF for organizing the seminar and letting me write this paper. I should emphasize before we go into the discussion that these are my views, personal views, that are not reflective of the IMF or its board. Also, I'm grateful because, as some of you may know, I'm going to retire from the IMF within 2 months, and so in a sense, this is my swan song. I'm not an expert on these issues, I should admit that, but it's an issue that's close to my heart, and that's why I'm grateful that we can talk about this in this particular panel discussion. I've been in many international settings, conferences, of course, the work of the IMF, and as George said at the beginning, we look at many aspects of inequality, but that one, it's so prevalent in so many countries, and each country in some sense does try to deal with it on its own. And I think there's just a lot of value in an international dialogue and in trying to learn from each other on best practices. And so since I was kind of trying to get the conversation started, I'm really grateful that we're joined by 3 experts in the field who have published on these issues and who have a reputation of really having contributed great ideas to the topic. And if by the end of it, we have a sense that there is value of this international dialogue, I think then I feel that we would have achieved our mission today. Now, why is this so important? You know, there is, of course, a long-standing tendency that growth tends to be concentrated in areas of high productivity, that there is agglomeration, that there are network effects, but it's not just the recent elections in some advanced economies that have made clear that the kind of current level of the divide is really unsustainable. It's been a long issue before. I'm from Germany, and there we have the split between East and West Germany. It's been an issue in Italy, in the UK, in the US, of course. China has been mentioned, but Era will also tell us that the issue is really prevalent in other Asian countries too. So we need to address this growing inequality that has been fostered also by technology and by modern technology, by modern production chains and the like. Some people will say, well, it's not really just an economic issue, it's also a cultural issue. There are, you know, issues of ethnic divergences, there are issues of minorities. I think that this is sometimes a bit overstated. But having said that, for example, in a country like Germany, where the population is, you know, still fairly homogeneous, there is a clear issue of how people in Eastern Germany felt treated after unification that led to some of these divisions. So it's a very difficult and complicated mix. And the policy solutions are obviously have to be very individualized. But as I said, I think there is a lot of things that people can learn from each other. Why is it so important to address the issues? It's beyond the addressing minorities and cultural issues. It's also the productive potential of economies. If we neglect to bring a large share of the population and up and endow them with strong human capital, then countries will have difficulties meeting the potential growth that they will need to, meet their debt service requirements, keep their debt levels in check, and achieve the growth that is needed to also, for example, in aging populations, to take care of the elderly. And then there's the whole issue of climate change and the policies that will need to be taken to achieve the net zero growth eventually. I think that has major implications for rural populations, especially, and we can talk separately about that. But this is kind of the context in which I see the debate.
Thanks, Martin. Absolutely, you bring up some really great points that I hope we'll continue to talk through. And as you mentioned, your paper does a nice job of explaining in a little more detail what you see as some of the risks in particular of the rural decline. Rural areas are frequently, though I would argue, and we'll hear from others, not exclusively at the disadvantage. I think we're increasingly seeing more inequality within cities and within rural areas themselves, and we'll hopefully talk a little bit more about that. But if we care about inclusive growth, why should we care about rural-urban divide, and in particular the risks of rural decline?
Well, as I said, I mean, the productive potential of an economy really requires everybody to be fully integrated in the economic process. But let's perhaps talk a little bit about the climate dimension also. You know, we've been talking a lot about infrastructure investment in rural areas that will bring jobs to rural areas, because we have to install, say, wind turbines, or we have to reforest large areas, or we need biofuels that are helping the environment. And this transition will not be able to do if we don't bring the large areas of and the many voters that are in rural areas, and many of who are dependent on the carbon economy at the moment, if we don't bring them along. I mean, there's a very interesting parallel in the US, for example. When you look at the outcome of the last elections, the divide between, for example, Republicans and Democrats is not only between, say, cities and rural areas, it's also between economies and counties that are that are largely dependent on the carbon economy, or areas that are more dependent on knowledge economies. So it is a very important economic issue. It is a very important issue going forward also for the success of climate policies. And as economists, we're always kind of quick to say, well, you know, as macroeconomists, we're quick to say, well, we have the infrastructure investment, we have a social safety net. These are big macro parameters that we can set, and the rest will follow. But even with infrastructure investment, sometimes it doesn't necessarily follow that we will get jobs in rural areas. I mean, we've tried in the past. Eastern Germany is a very good example. And yet these political divisions persist. So I think we need to really kind of go down into this structural area. And both macroeconomists need to do this. There needs to be a dialogue, a bridge between macroeconomists and experts in the field, spatial economists, geographers, anthropologists, you name it. And there needs to be a bit of an interdisciplinary dialogue to get to these policies that find widespread acceptance, so that they persist and that we have a sustainable effort that will be successful.
Absolutely. And so clearly this is a complex, multifaceted challenge, and your note alludes to the fact that it will require a multifaceted solution, as well as continued dialogue, research, and I would add more and more data collection and evidence building about what works and what doesn't. Your paper, as you started to mention, surfaces a number of policy options, some showing more success or more promise than others at mitigating disparity. As we get ready to bring in the panel, can you just highlight a few more of the policy options that you surface in the paper so that we can continue that conversation with our panel and get some further thoughts?
Yeah. So first of all, I think on the social safety net and social measures, I think there's broad agreement that there has to be unemployment benefits, there has to be earned income tax credits, there have to be certain programs just to maintain basic living standards. That I think is, you know, broadly that you find economists broadly in agreement with. But the point is, it's not really sufficient to lift the fortunes of these regions. You need employment growth. And then I mentioned that there's infrastructure spending. I think that's necessary, but whether it's a sufficient condition is a question. Sometimes, and our panelists certainly will be able to say more to that, sometimes infrastructure also helps to increase the concentration more. Think about if you have better roads, better internet connections, do local stores really benefit from that? Or is it just leading to bigger network effects for the great companies? That's a very important question. Then second, I once talked to a central bank governor in a Latin American country about long-term growth prospects. And what he said was, yeah, there are three policies for that: education, education, education. So that's a very typical and also correct to some extent answer by a macroeconomist. But how do we do that? Do we just spend more on education? Does this make sure that we get people really into better jobs and better universities? I would think that while it's necessary, it's not sufficient, because once we have better education in rural areas, do we also have the same professional networks for people that they benefit from? Do they get the same internships that people in the urban areas that are going to the quote unquote better schools? I think there's a lot to be done to really make sure that education is not just money spent on schools, but that it's also done in a way that people really benefit. And largely, and then again, that's something more for our panelists, but place-based policies is something that's hotly debated among macro people. There's one group that says, well, it just displaces jobs from one area if you spend more on the other. And therefore, why don't we let just the market solve it? And others, of course, like Tim Bartik, for example, has a lot to tell us about what policies could work and what should be done. I would just add that this is not something that a central government by itself can do. You need also, of course, very strong governance at the local area. It's not enough to spend money on rural areas. We also need to make sure it's being wisely used, and that people do make the best out of their small tax revenue bases that they have. And I'd be curious to hear what can be done in the dialogue between central and local levels to foster that kind of governance that one would need.
Great, thank you, Martin. You've given us so much to chew on already, and agree when we think about the education issues and the education challenge, it is very much not only about increasing access, but about increasing quality. And that does go beyond building schools and education infrastructure, which is critically important, and the digital infrastructure, which is critically important in schools and in societies at large, especially for commerce, as we've seen, but also when it comes to education, about teachers and about the opportunities and the relevance of education for the economies and the labor markets where people are and where people are moving to and will continue to move, again, within rural areas, between rural and secondary cities, and into cities at large. So a lot to unpack and to continue to discuss, and some really great points already. And again, please do go ahead and read the brief so you can see more about these ideas, from these good ideas from Martin in full. But with that, let me bring in Tim, Era, and Andrés, and start by asking each of you just your kind of initial response to Martin's note and our dialogue in terms of your thoughts on why spatial inequalities are so persistent. Is it an issue of political will to implement the right measures, or do we just not necessarily yet know what we need to do in the most effective way? What are some of the promising ideas that you've seen in your work that are currently or could be pursued? And then lastly, in terms of your initial response, how can we really energize the conversation? How can we stimulate research and promote the global exchange of ideas that we need to continue to surface these ideas? So we'll start with Tim, over to you for your ideas, and then we'll hear from Era and Andrés.
Well, thank you for inviting me for this. The first point I want to make at the outset, this was titled The Rural-Urban Divide, and obviously the local labor market problem is in part a rural problem in many countries, but including the US, but it's also a problem of some small and medium-sized cities. I live in Michigan, Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan. You got California, Fresno, Bakersfield, Mobile, Alabama, McAllen, Texas. You could list many small and medium-sized cities that have serious problems with low employment to population ratios, low employment rates. As to why these problems are so persistent, I think it's largely because low employment rates at the spatial level, there's not only individual persistence, but there are social spillovers that are persistent. So when you have low employment rates, low employment population ratios, it creates problems with mental health, with substance abuse, with crime. That all creates many barriers to redeveloping an area. It also creates problems with the tax base so that the area no longer has sufficient resources to really invest in the programs that might solve that problem. So I do think part of the problem is simply mobilizing the resources, which requires assistance from some higher level of government. But another part is, can we identify policies that have a sufficiently low cost per job created? And once you create the jobs, a sufficient number of them actually go to the folks who lack jobs, that they could pass a benefit cost test. Now, economists' instinct on this is to say, okay, you have this problem with non-employment, you don't have enough jobs in the area, let's just subsidize jobs. And that's kind of an automatic response of economists. And the problem there is that when you look at like employment subsidies, such as business tax incentives, they in so many cases simply subsidize what would have happened anyway, that the cost per actual job that is truly induced by the subsidy is often quite high. So what I push in a lot of my work is to say, why don't we do more in some business services, particularly to small and medium-sized businesses, that have shown evidence that they have a value to the businesses that significantly exceed their costs, and therefore they can have a higher bang for the buck. So the kind of business services I mean include customized job training programs where you train workers for a firm's particular needs. Things like business advice programs, such as manufacturing extension services that provide advice on new markets and new technologies to small and medium-sized manufacturers. There's a lot of evidence that these particular business services can create jobs at perhaps 1/3 the cost of simply throwing money at the problem through employment subsidies. I think infrastructure is fine. I think land development is fine, but I think those work better if you integrate them with services. So instead of just having land for business development, let's have a business incubator that has associated business services. That's more effective. And I also think employment subsidies can work, but if they're integrated with these things. So let's go to a firm and say, we're going to provide you customized job training, and if as part of the program you're willing to hire some of the hardcore non-employed, maybe you also get a cash subsidy for that for a period of time. But let's integrate it with these other services. The other thing I think we need to recognize in dealing with this problem is that one size does not fit all. There's no such thing as a single solution to local labor market problems. Some areas have a manufacturing base of some sort, and so some solution addressing that is needed. Some areas may have some nearby universities, some high-tech strengths. So maybe that high-tech strategy makes sense. Some places may be close enough to major cities that they can maybe play a distribution role. Some rural areas that have high amenities, maybe tourism makes sense. Maybe promoting remote work makes sense. We mentioned climate change. Maybe some areas could do something with solar energy or wind power. That might be a possibility. But what is going to work for one area will not work for another area. So what I pushed in this policy area is, rather than the national government or the regional government going to these local labor markets saying we're just going to provide funds for broadband or whatever. Let's provide a block grant that can be used flexibly in these distressed local labor markets. Let's target the distressed local labor markets, give them a block grant. It can be used for infrastructure. It can be used for customized job training. It can be used for small business incubators, manufacturing extension services. Let's let creativity operate at the local level, and let's be able to develop a package of policies that work for that area. And finally, you mentioned, well, how can we improve research in this area? Well, I think partly depends how we design the policies. We're never going to have randomized controlled trials in which we randomly assign some regions to get block grants and some regions not to get block grants. And we're never going to have a randomized controlled trial where we randomly assign some firms to get customized job training grants and other firms not to get them. But we can encourage strategies where we ask governments to allocate these resources through some kind of rational scoring system where, say, a national government says, we're going to score these applications from distressed local labor markets. Some score could be based on a combination of the distressed local labor market and the quality of the strategy. And then we're going to award grants to those, the highest scoring ones. And then we can do a comparison that looks at areas that just made the cutoff for being assisted and those that just missed it. We can do a similar thing with some of these assistance programs for small, medium-sized business. We have a limited pool of funds for customized job training. We'll have a scoring system where we look at the needs of the firm and how the distress in the area. We'll award some grants to some firms and not others. We can then compare those just below and above the scoring cutoff and see what works. And I think if we actually do systematic policies where we hand out the grants rationally either to regions or firms, then over time, I think we will learn a lot more about which programs work better and which programs don't work as well. So I'll stop there and turn it over to the panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. I agree with so much of what you said, and we'll look to further unpack it. I mean, this issue you related to mostly American cities, but really we could be talking about cities in rural and urban and rural areas around the world really facing these same issues. And in particular, that mismatch we often are seeing between supply and demand in the labor markets, and even some of that smoothing and market clearing, if you will, in the labor markets. Let's hear from Era now with her initial reactions and thoughts.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for having me on this panel. So let me make 3 points. First, large and rising spatial disparities can arise in very different contexts and for very different reasons. In many advanced economies, such as the US, UK, but not all, there's been a growing divergence between rich and poor places since the 1990s. And this rise in spatial disparities appears to be associated with negative economic shocks brought about by globalization and skill-based technological change. The disappearance of good jobs, the proliferation of bad jobs, and combined with depressed regional labor markets have resulted in the declining fortunes of many small and medium-sized towns, as well as rural areas. In many emerging market and developing countries, regional disparities when it comes to, or spatial disparities in income, in disposable income and productivity, in poverty, in living standards, particular rural-urban divides are even larger than what you see in advanced economies. But the available evidence does not seem to suggest a broad-based increase in the pre-COVID world. In fact, most of the recent rise in inequality in China is primarily due to rising income dispersion both within urban and rural areas, rather than rising from growing urban-rural inequality. And these spatial disparities in developing countries have typically resulted from economic takeoffs and the associated structural transformation from agriculture to manufacturing to services that spread unevenly across regions. In other words, these are the positive shocks that we see in China or India or in Vietnam. And what we see is that wide variation in the provision of physical infrastructure, roads and communication networks and education and other basic services, and possibly stronger agglomeration effects than in advanced economies, they tend to lead to a persistence of disparity. So the underlying drivers of disparities in these groups of countries are different. My second point is that COVID-19 makes the challenge of reducing regional inequalities even greater than before, as the pandemic has reinforced, or in many cases amplified, existing spatial inequalities. COVID has affected the health, livelihoods, and potentially even future prospects of people in different ways, depending upon where they live. So let me give you an example of my own research. Remote work opportunities are a really important vector of spatial inequalities, as the feasibility to do remote work varies very starkly within countries. And part of this is related to differences in digital literacy and infrastructure, which are very unevenly distributed within countries. For instance, in urban areas in Latin America, 67% of households are connected, while in rural areas in these countries, only 23%. And these, even in advanced economies, these types of regional gaps in access to high-speed internet can be quite stark. Yet, the pandemic seems to have also accelerated automation and digitalization, and these trends tend to favor more skill-intensive sectors that are concentrated in knowledge centers or in urban areas. My third point is that given these differences in trends across advanced and emerging market countries and the underlying drivers, there really is, as Tim pointed out, no one-size-fits-all policy or silver bullet. Policies will have to, redistribution, labor market, education, and a host of other policies will have to be considered jointly. So let me give you some examples. As Martin pointed out, there is still a role for universal or spatially blind people-based policies to address regional disparities in countries, particularly where capital and labor are relatively mobile. So programs such as the child tax credit or the earned income tax credit or the Bolsa Familia in Brazil disproportionately benefit low-income households and can have the effect, without any real spatial targeting, explicit spatial targeting involved, of reducing interregional income disparities, for instance. In developing countries, it's really back to the basic. When I think about countries like Vietnam or Nepal or Laos, it's really back to the basic policies to strengthen public services such as health, education, rural electrification, and these can go a long way in reducing disparities. Public funding for broadband and computers for children in disadvantaged backgrounds can also be a good way to bridge digital divides. Secondly, spatially connected policies, and here we're thinking about investment in highways and roads, public transportation. These could complement universal policies along with a host of other things in place. And one good example here is this concept of rural-urban integrated cities that was developed in South Korea. And this policy program was launched in the mid-1990s, and it aimed at reducing rural-urban disparities by integrating rural counties with cities in a holistic way, in a unified framework that incorporated transportation links, land use, public service provision, as well as local administration. So having this kind of a more holistic way to address, to implement spatial connected policies can be very useful. Third, I strongly believe that a new focus on directly fostering good jobs and labor market experiences is going to be absolutely crucial in the post-COVID world. Not all people can move, and what we see in lagging regions or poorer areas is that job opportunities have stagnated. And so, policies that sort of call for a further hollowing out of skills from declining regions, may not necessarily always be first best. And there is a role for place-sensitive or place-based policies that Tim has talked about. I agree with Tim in that, the nature of these policies, the evidence in these policies is mixed, but the nature of these policies matters in terms of if it's going to bear fruit on the ground. So thinking about innovative ways of providing content or delivery or financing of training or retraining, including new ways of thinking about public-private partnerships or employer-focused active labor market policies can really help with upskilling workers that is in a way that's commensurate with local conditions. In Vietnam, for instance, my own research seems to suggest that business incentives that are focused on good jobs in rural areas, and again, this is sort of the kind of customized business services that Tim was talking about, can be very useful in encouraging both worker and firm formalization in rural areas. As you know, in many developing countries, informality is sort of the order of the day. So these types of sort of customized business incentives can really help firms in rural areas formalize. It can help with worker formalization and raise labor productivity. Tony Atkinson has talked about the importance of innovation, of encouraging innovation to help generate good jobs. There isn't a whole lot of research in this area, but it's conceivable that existing tax incentives for R&D and innovation could potentially be made contingent on employment outcomes. And depending upon the location of universities, university industry linkages could be fostered to encourage skill development and the absorption of innovation. And finally, when it comes to social protection, I think one key challenge in many countries is how portable social benefits are. And this non-portability of state and local benefits in many advanced economies in Europe as well as in the US is often a major deterrent to labor mobility. This in conjunction with very high housing costs in urban areas. So when we think about sort of the appropriate mix of policies, I mean, ultimately it's really country context specific. I mean, the right mix differs between advanced and emerging market economies, between higher, lower income areas or states or regions, high density versus low density areas, and also depends on the key drivers of regional disparities. And fiscal costs of all of these programs, and whether or not municipal, local governments have the policy space, whether the central government has the policy space and implementation capacity, all of these are really important considerations in deciding what is an appropriate policy mix to address these issues. And very briefly, you talked about sort of what can be done to energize. I think from my vantage point, from the IMF's vantage point, I think data is sort of the first call of day. In developing countries, India, China, this data is not readily available. So making available harmonized data on region level disparities or more local level disparities is key, because the paucity of data makes an assessment of emerging trends or effectiveness of policies very complicated. A second thing is trying to measure regional or local economic data in real time. I mean, I think COVID really showed us this, that it can be very helpful in informing where and how to target policy interventions and then to evaluate their effectiveness very rapidly to decide whether programs need to be scaled up or scaled down. And a final example is that countries put in place all kinds of innovative interventions during COVID. For instance, developing countries put in place digital solutions to reach previously underserved populations using mobile payment systems, or other countries modified contributory schemes to account for informal employment and other forms of employment that exists in rural areas. There was a lot of innovation when it came to helping firms. So stepping back and thinking about what can we learn from this pandemic, and how can this be used? How can these policies that were put in place in a very ad hoc manner be used to address regional inequalities or spatial inequalities could be worthwhile. Let me stop here.
Really fantastic. And your points about the need for the digital literacy and the digital skill building to accompany the digital infrastructure in order to enable some of those digital solutions really resonates with me and some of the work I've been doing on the digital skills side. And also the points about the holistic approaches we're seeing. I've been watching and working on some of the corridor work that we're seeing out of the mega cities in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, as well as we see some of that work happening in Latin America and Asia. So really important points. And without further ado, let's get Andrés to weigh in. Already so much rich discussion. Look forward to hearing from Andrés, and then hopefully we'll still have a bit of time to get to a few audience and follow-up questions. Andrés, over to you for your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you very much for the invitation. As has been discussed and everyone has noticed, there has been a wave of discontent across many parts of the world that has manifested itself in many, many different ways. But the whole world has caught the attention of the world mainly after the events in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump in the US and the Brexit vote in the UK. This is something that it comes from before, and we have had this discontent in many parts of Europe, whether it's in France, whether it's in Italy, whether it's in the Netherlands, or in countries like Hungary or Poland for now the best of 2 decades. But it's not just the developed countries. In the developing world, in many ways, this has been far more pervasive for quite some times. One key example is the case of, for example, Thailand. That was one of the fastest growing countries, if not the fastest, in Southeast Asia. And since the political stalemate between the more dynamic center in Bangkok and the poorer and less dynamic lowlands of the center of the country and the remote northern areas and northeastern areas, what we have had is fairly low levels of growth in comparison to many countries in the same area that were behind. And if you're Argentinian, you have been living with this for the last century or so, in which declining areas of the country and less developed areas of the country have repeatedly expressed their discontent at the ballot box. why is this happening? And this is something that Martin has highlighted in his presentation, in his paper. Some of it is, of course, culture and identity wars that I'm not going to talk about here because it's not the topic. Many work done on Brexit and the rise of populism in Europe talks about age, education, gender, race, job opportunities that Tim actually mentioned in his presentation. And there's a focus, much more economic, on the level of inequalities. But as when we think about inequalities, we tend to think about interpersonal inequalities. As Era said, and said very well, they tend to be far higher within regions than across regions. Having said that, these inequalities at the moment are not the ones that are setting our countries, our cities, our regions alight. It doesn't mean that they are unimportant. They are growing and they will have implications. But it is the much lower, at least in the developed world, because in developing countries, territorial inequalities are far higher, as was mentioned already by Era, than what we see in terms of in developed countries. But it is the interterritorial inequalities that make the difference. And I think Tim is right here. This is not just a urban-rural issue. In some places, rural areas, like in Germany, have done very well. In others, they haven't done as well. But it's mainly a combination of places that have been declining and with places that have been booming for quite some time. And there are different types of decline. You can decline from above. So you have areas like the north of Italy or the north of England that were once Detroit, that was mentioned by Tim, highly prosperous and that had been actually going in reverse for quite some time. There are also areas that grew very quickly and have hit a wall. They have hit a development trap, like, for example, what Martin mentioned of East Germany, that after reunification caught up very quickly for a short period of time and then has been stuck at very low levels of development for the best of now 25 years. And this decline and stagnation is creating problems. The question is, should we care? And my answer here is clearly yes. For many reasons. The first reason is that this rise of discontent, this rise of inequalities and territorial inequalities is leaving a lot of potential economic potential untapped. We tend to think, and economic geography, new economic geography, urban economics has told us in the last 3 decades that probably the greatest opportunities for growth happen in the big cities. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But if we look at the reality, we look at what's happening across the world. For example, we take the Fortune 500 firms, 19% of that, 96 out of 500 are located in cities of less than 500,000 inhabitants. 2 of the largest and biggest companies in Europe, the biggest apparel company in the world, Inditex, and IKEA, the biggest flat pack company in furniture, they were born in small villages in declining places and have grown out of nothing. But we look at other places, for example, in Germany, the big cities are not the most prosperous cities. It's not Berlin and it's not the Ruhr that have been driving the country. It's very small areas that have managed to actually create hidden champions. So there's significant potential that is materializing in Germany and is not materializing in France or in Argentina, for example. So the question is, why is this happening in some places and not in the others? But as importantly is that this growing economic and social divide, both within countries and across countries, is leading to a threat to democracy. Let us not forget what happened at the beginning of this year in the US. But not just that, is also leading to unhappiness and discontent that is rising at the ballot box. And as a result of that, we have Brexit in the UK. And with Brexit in the UK, what's going to happen is that, according to most studies, there's going to be not the places that we're already losing out going to lose even more. What we're going to see is that places that were formerly prosperous, like the UK, London, where I live and work, are going to lose out. And as a result, the whole of the UK is going to lose out. So that has significant implications for future development. And then, of course, the thing is that we need to do something. But we have now plenty of evidence that many of the things that we have done in the past do not work. What have we done? Well, there has been a lot of mention of infrastructure. And of course, in many places of the world, especially in less developed areas, less accessible areas, infrastructure is needed. And it's needed strongly. But in many parts of Europe, the emphasis of infrastructure has led to 2 factors. A lot of cathedrals in the desert, white elephants that have served nothing. And in many cases, to a concentration of economic activity in more dynamic spaces. This is what we have seen through massive European investment in regional development in countries like Spain or Portugal, where the biggest beneficiaries have been Lisbon and Madrid as a result of the development of fundamentally transport infrastructure. So in the interest of time, and then there are other options. There has been a lot of talk of subsidies here and on public employment. This is something that has been probably less tried in other parts of the world. In Europe, we have plenty of experience on this. The south of Italy has been subsidized since the 1950s. In many areas of Europe, consciously and unconsciously, to combat decline, national governments have invested heavily in the creation of jobs, mostly in the public sector, to the extent that in virtually every single country in Europe, the less developed, the more declining regions have got levels of public employment that go over 30% of the total, in some cases 50% of the total. But if we go to the most extreme case, which is the region of Corsica in France, one of the poorest and most declining in relative terms regions there, what we have seen is that 50% of public employment has not actually led to any significance of emergence of new opportunities, of the type of opportunities that Tim and Era were talking about. And it has also created it has not also addressed the problem of discontent. 3 of the 4 members of parliament coming from Corsica are pro-independence populists, despite the fact of the massive transfer of money. And it has generated massive sheltered economies, protected economies that are less capable of fending for themselves than others. So what can be done? And briefly in 1 minute, we have to first, in my view, ban this artificial dichotomy between people-based and place-based policies, because it's not helpful at all. All policies affect people and all policies affect places. And the so-called, let's say, spatially blind or people-based policies have an implication. In the case of Spain, years of policies to foster innovation has led to 80% of that investment being concentrated in Madrid and Barcelona. Trade policy, we're talking about macro policy here in the UK, has generated more jobs than it has destroyed. The problem is that the jobs that have been generated have been in the south east of England, in London and the surrounding area. The problems that the jobs that have been destroyed in the north of England. And now, as a result of that, the whole of England is going to grow less, and London is going to be much less dynamic, according to most studies of what has been. So we need what Tim has emphasized, that no one-size-fits-all policy. We need what I would consider place-sensitive policies, which are not place-based. It's not that it's a free-for-all and each place needs to go its own way. We need to have clear sets of criteria. We have to have policies that are based on sound theory, on sound evidence, and that need to actually address the problems of different types of, or similar types of problems in similar types of regions, of groups, of cities within countries, and even across countries in places that are highly integrated. And this needs to combine horizontal interventions of the types that we have done, depending on the conditions. And that was something that was strongly emphasized by Tim. Like, for example, more emphasis, why not on infrastructure, but also education, innovation at the local level, attraction of foreign direct investment. But also we need to build on what is in each place. And Tim has already also talked about this. But the idea that it's much easier to build on something that you have than to start from scratch. We have seen many high-tech illusions that have led nowhere. That doesn't mean that we're going to build and stay still and do the same. It's built to increase complexity, increase diversity, to actually be capable of reinventing sectors that perhaps have been struggling into something that is new by moving them and transforming them into related sectors. If we manage to do that, I think we are probably on the right track to address a problem that, if we don't do it, it's not that we're going to have a serious economic problem, is that we're going to kiss goodbye. We're also going to have a serious social and political problem, but we're going to kiss goodbye some of the very policies that are so much needed, because, for example, in terms of combating climate change, if we end up with liberal and anti-system parties governing most of the world, or just a few countries in the world, we are not going to have any sort of consensus in addressing these problems that are urgent and need coordinated policies, both within countries and across the whole world.
Great, thank you so much, Andres, for adding more richness to an already rich discussion. A few, really interesting themes I think are popping out from the comments and from the responses. Just this idea of untapped potential, the idea of, is it people versus place or people and place? When we think about the solutions, the idea of integration in terms of the different ideas, integration between rural and urban areas, and the political economy considerations, which are not only kind of political economy drivers, but the political economy implications and moving into solutions. And as we turn back to you all for a short additional follow-up, taking those themes together and all the comments that have come out already, and going back to Josh's initial introduction, as we've talked about these idea of the geographic and the spatial inequality, we shouldn't and necessarily can't overlook some of the other areas of inequality that have been so dramatically aggravated by the COVID pandemic and that tend to mirror, if not overlap, if you will, with spatial inequality, and whether that's gender inequality, where we're seeing dramatic proportions of women leaving the workforce, generational age inequality, in particular, how youth have been so hit hard by the education and job loss and education disruption and job loss by the pandemic, as well as the racial issues that have been addressed and introduced as well. So tying some of those themes and that question together, I'll turn it back to each of you for just a very kind of short last thought that addresses, your thoughts on your observances and experiences with that interplay between inequality, and what do you think that means for our vision going forward and the dialogue that needs to take place. Martin, we'll start with you for your sort of quick thoughts, and then we'll go to the rest of the panel.
Thank you. I already can see how rich the dialogue is between experts that come from different, geographic backgrounds also. So there's already a lot of information that I kind of picked up that I could imagine would be very deepened if this topic were to be taken up by a subgroup of the G20 or the G7 or other international fora. I think it is really high time for a dialogue about approaches that work and some that don't. Andres said, this is not working. ERA had a great example from what Korea has done. Can we get people, policymakers that were involved in these issues to actually share their experiences and think about better ways? The one aspect that for me, I think is important and will be very difficult to address is how in the world can we get governments to develop the capacity to help local areas, help local governments address these issues? Coming up with policies that have worked in one place doesn't mean that the officials that are in the other place are necessarily ready to implement them or have the knowledge to do that. How can we kind of develop a government, even a bureaucracy, if you want, that can actually facilitate all these different, very specific, locally applicable solutions without creating a monster that will not deliver these policies at a level of detail that is really necessary? And how can we then also strengthen the capacities and the governance of local officials? There's also local politics often at play. They are also influenced by existing technologies, existing interests that would be somewhat displaced by new businesses. So I'm still kind of puzzled by, when it gets to the micro issue, how we can really implement all that and how the federal government can help without developing into another bureaucracy that creates jobs but doesn't add to solutions. So it's a very delicate balance, and I think a lot of it will depend on how it's implemented in practice. But there is really a need for a dialogue between different governments and people that have experience in that, and I think that's really the outcome for me of this discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Martin. And let me take those thoughts over. Actually, I'm going to come to you, Era, for your just last thoughts. And as you weave in this question around interplay of dynamics of inequalities, and I'm going to add one piece to the mix for you that came in from our audience, which I think you might have some interesting thoughts on, is the role of outmigration and the role of the concern about brain drain, if you will, or brain waste, for the term that some others use, and your thoughts on that as we wrap up.
Thanks, Nicole. So I think you're right in that there is a very strong interplay between these various forms of inequality. I mean, just give you an example. We talked about remote work and the opportunity to do so. The ability for people in low-income households to do remote work, the ability for women to engage in this kind of work, the ability for youth who tend to be in some of the more affected sectors, such as accommodation, food services, and so forth, to work remotely varies tremendously. So, when we think about these kind of rural-urban divides or spatial divides, and we also think about the ability for people to work in specific sectors or to work remotely, to use technology, we see that there's a considerable amount of overlap, and it's not surprising that the areas or the sectors that have been most affected, and the people that have been most affected, are sort of the same in each of these areas. So from that perspective, I think thinking about more holistic federal or national level policies, issues of progressive, should tax systems be made more progressive, the nature of social protection and transfer systems. I think there's we have to aggregate back up to the extent that there's sort of this Venn diagram where all these various types of inequalities meet. We have to aggregate up and think about issues from a universal standpoint, and then bring it down to what it means for specific place-sensitive types of policies. In terms of the issue of outmigration, when you look at developing countries in particular, outmigration has played a very important role in raising wages in poorer parts because they remit money back to these regions, and we've seen this dynamic take hold in India and in China, where migrants from poorer rural areas move to the cities and send back remittances, which raise wages. It creates a host of other problems, but this labor mobility has sort of served as an equalizing, bit of an equalizing force, in the sense that rural wages have increased. The challenge is when there's brain drain in low density areas, and I think that's where you see the sort of hollowing out of skills and cities that really fall behind. And so the kind of policies that are needed to encourage migration and to provide opportunities to workers, the kind of structural transformation, if you will, that I spoke of in developing countries, that process is very different. I mean, in India, China, we need to think about sort of raising agricultural productivity that frees up workers from the land so that they can move into higher value-added manufacturing and services sectors. In developed countries, the story is very different. In many advanced economies, the story is really about how do you create job opportunities on the ground, and it's how do you strike this balance between reinvigorating rural and communities or small towns, as opposed to sort of allowing this kind of mobility, or economic and social mobility. So there is more of a trade-off from that perspective. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Era. Wonderful to be able to get your perspective today on all of these really important points. Let me move over to you, Tim, for your last thoughts on what you've heard, as well as this idea of this interplay, and then we'll hear from Andres on his final thoughts.
Thanks. Well, on your thing of trying to reduce individual inequalities or racial inequalities, so let me just give a concrete example, since obviously race is a key issue in the U.S. Always, and especially now. Typically the Black unemployment rate is twice the white unemployment rate in the U.S., not just the national level, but the local level. So part of the issue is if you help a distressed area and lower the overall unemployment rate, it will actually lower the Black unemployment rate more. That's not enough. There's no, it's not a law of nature that the Black unemployment rate is twice that of the white unemployment rate. We need, much more vigorous anti-discrimination laws and enforcement of them in employment. We need to talk about improving educational opportunities in all schools. And we need to talk about helping neighborhoods, predominantly African-American neighborhoods, by having neighborhood employment hubs that can connect people with training programs and placement programs with job opportunities throughout the area. So I think, but it's easier to do all this if you have enough jobs in the overall area. If the overall pie is bigger, it's easier, a little bit easier to figure out how to divide it up better. And then the one other comment I'll make, since Martin commented on how do we create kind of local leadership and the right local plans, I'll just plug a book, not a book I wrote, but one of my favorite books on regional economic development is called Why the Garden Club Couldn't Save Youngstown by Sean Safford, who I think is a business sociologist. And it tries to figure out why Allentown, Pennsylvania did much better than Youngstown, Ohio in responding to the steel industry collapse in the US in the early 1980s. And it really had to do with the quality of local institutions and leadership. In Youngstown, they tried to lobby for higher steel tariffs. In Allentown, they sat down and said, we need to diversify our economy and make some public investments. And we need to do this on a sustained basis. And you had the right business and university and government leadership to pull that together. So I really do think that we need not just economists, but political science and sociologists to figure out how do we create a culture that really has local leadership that brings a lot of interest groups together and figures out a way of investing for the future.
Excellent points. Thank you so much, Tim. And again, really a pleasure to hear your thoughts today. Andres, final thoughts from you as we bring this event to a closure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicole. On the inequality, Era mentioned this in her talk, but the OECD has created a classification of places in which more people can work remotely, and they come normally the big cities, New York, Washington, London, Paris, Brussels come on top. Many areas in Turkey and Southern Europe, very often dependent on tourism, are at levels of less than 20% with relationship to those that are more than 50%. But let's not fall in the ecological fallacy here, because within our cities we have significant differences in terms of inequality, and that's something that has been made plain by the COVID-19 pandemic. That when New York, for example, was ravaged by the pandemic in March, April, May 2020, the ones that decamped actually behave in a way that was very similar to what medieval kings and feudal lords did in medieval plagues. They moved out of the city, went to their housing manors, and then closed the gates of the city. So what we have seen is people that have decamped from New York, and there has been a lot of talk, to the Hamptons or to the Hudson Valley or to Miami, and the essential workers have remained trapped in the city. They are much less mobile. And very often, as Tim has highlighted, these are racial minorities. So there's a problem that is exploding and is going to explode, but it's something that also precedes the pandemic. Let me just talk about the high school dropout from Boston, Lincolnshire. And I put Boston, Lincolnshire because it's the place in England that had the highest vote for Brexit. But I could have put anyone in a similar condition from Cottbus or Chemnitz in East Germany. These people cannot move out. So this idea that you move to where there are opportunities, move to, for example, Munich, or move to London, or move to San Francisco, the Bay Area, is not for them. Because first, they don't have the skills, they don't have the capacity, but also even if they had them, they have their social networks, their families, their lives there, and they probably like living there. So this is an unhelpful sort of situation in which traditional policies are not going to deal with. We can also not do nothing. Wait for trickle down and mobility to solve the problem. I think Martin has made it very clear it's not going to work. So what can be done? We have talked about place sensitive, and I'm going to say that this is already going on. The European Union, although it has remained under the radar, had the biggest reform of its cohesion policy in 2014, the biggest reform since 1989. And it has had teething problems. We are coming out of the first 7-year programming period after it was implemented, in which it implemented something called smart specialization, which was more place-based than place-sensitive. But it implied some principles like, for example, although the European Union provided technical support and provided funding, the ownership, the decision-making, the strategy-making was actually owned at local level. Of course, this implies, and it has been highlighted by Era, it has been highlighted by Tim talking about leadership, the capacity building, which also Martin mentioned. But even this is something that it's ongoing. But for the first time in many of the policies that I have studied in my career, this is a policy that has put institutions, institutional bottlenecks, and capacity building at its heart. And it's probably the way to go forward. Of course, there are a lot of things that can be improved, but it's probably a much better option than just blanket subsidies as have been proposed elsewhere.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
I'm sorry. It's just we're running over, and I know we might be losing some folks. So, and I think that's just a really apropos place to stop. And you even gave us a little bit of economic history. So maybe we all got a little bit more than we bargained for today, getting into medieval territory. With that, let me just do a very quick thank you to our fantastic panelists, and of course to Martin and the International Monetary Fund for his paper, and turn it back over to Josh Lipsky to wrap us up and really bring us out of this really fantastic dynamic conversation today.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you to the entire panel and Martin for just a fascinating conversation. And Martin, what you said about the G20 and taking this forward, timely given the G20 finance ministers meeting this weekend. And it's about action. And that's what this whole event was centered around, call to action, not just talking about it, but doing something about it. So thank you all for being part of that. It's just the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. And it's summer in Washington, I think, but neither the IMF or the Atlantic Council are slowing down. The IMF made a major announcement this morning on special drawing rights, which can have implications for what we're talking about today. So I encourage those who haven't seen it yet to read about it, more process for them to go through, but an exciting development. We at the Atlantic Council have 3 major events next week, starting with Director General of the WTO on Tuesday, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Then on Wednesday, Digital Services Tax event. Then on Thursday, an event on sanctions. All the links are in the chat. So we hope everyone stays involved and stays with us. I want to thank the IMF for their collaboration on this event. I want to thank in particular Anita and Jennifer and all our colleagues in communications at the fund. And I finally, on a kind of note of personal privilege, want to thank Nitya Biani, program assistant for us at the Atlantic Council. It's her last day with us. She was crucial in pulling this event together, in publishing Martin's paper, and crucial in everything we do at the center. So Nitya, we will miss you, and thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining us today.